The coldest winter I ever experienced wasn't the one with the snow. It was the night my father handed me a trash bag, opened the front door, and told me that as far as he was concerned, Lily Rose was dead. I was 14, scared, and carrying a secret that was barely a few weeks old. They thought they knew how my story ended that night. They had no idea it was only the prologue. People talk about rock bottom like it's a place you hit and then bounce back from. For me, rock bottom was a literal sidewalk in the middle of a rainstorm. I stood there, clutching a plastic bag that held 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, and a diary I hadn't written in for months. My mother's face was the last thing I saw before the deadbolt clicked. She didn't cry. She didn't even look angry. She just looked finished, like I was a math problem she couldn't solve, so she just threw the paper away. I was in 9th grade. I should have been worrying about algebra or who was going to ask me to the winter formal. Instead, I was wondering which bus stop had the most overhead cover so I wouldn't get soaked. The pregnancy wasn't a choice, but in my small town, the why didn't matter, the how didn't matter. All that mattered was the shame I had brought into a house that valued reputation over blood. My father was a man of God, or so he told the neighbors, but that night there was no grace in his eyes, just cold, hard granite. I started walking. My shoes were already leaking. Every splash against the pavement felt like a heartbeat. Heavy, fast, and terrified. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a phone with a contact list full of saviors. I just had a name, Lily Rose, a girl who, according to her parents, didn't exist anymore. I remember passing the park where I used to play on the swings. It looked different in the dark. The chains rattled in the wind, sounding like distant laughter. I sat on a bench, the plastic bag tucked under my legs, and I promised myself something right then. I promised that if I survived the night, I would never let anyone own my narrative again. I wouldn't be the fallen girl or the tragedy. I would be something they couldn't even imagine. And I had to figure out how a child was supposed to raise a child when she didn't even have a roof over her head. The first few weeks were a blur of shelters and the kindness of strangers who had very little themselves. You learn a lot about the world when you're looking at it from the bottom up. You see the cracks in the sidewalk, the discarded wrappers, the people who look right through you like you're made of glass. I learned to be invisible. It was my only defense. If people didn't see me, they couldn't hurt me. If they didn't know my name, they couldn't take anything else away. But the secret I was carrying, it was growing, and eventually I knew I would have to face the one thing I feared more than the cold, the future. The first month on my own taught me that hunger isn't just a feeling in your stomach. It's a noise that echoes in your ears. It tells you exactly who you are when everything else is stripped away. I wasn't Lily Rose, the honor student, anymore. I was a ghost in a faded hoodie, navigating a world that wasn't built for 14-year-olds with no place to go. I found a temporary spot in a youth center 3 towns over. It smelled like industrial floor cleaner and desperation, but it had a lock on the bathroom door, and that felt like a luxury. The counselors there looked at me with a mix of pity and exhaustion. They'd seen 1,000 Lilies before. They expected me to break. They expected me to crawl back home and beg for a forgiveness that wasn't coming. But they didn't know about the fire starting to burn under my ribs. Every morning I'd wake up before the sun, watching the light creep over the peeling wallpaper. I'd touch my stomach, still flat, still keeping it secret, and I'd whisper to the life inside me. I told it about the mountains I'd climb. I told it about the ocean I'd never seen, but promised we'd find. It was the only thing in the world that belonged to me, and I belonged to it. Then came the morning everything changed. A woman named Sarah, a volunteer with silver hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every war imaginable, sat across from me at breakfast. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask who the father was. She just pushed a bowl of oatmeal toward me and said, "You have a very quiet way of being loud, Lily." I didn't answer. I just kept eating. "I have a sister in the city," Sarah continued, her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "She runs a small bakery. She needs someone to sweep, someone to pack boxes, someone who knows how to keep their mouth shut and work. There's a room above the shop. It's small, but it's dry." I looked up then. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel like it was crushing my lungs. "Why help me?" I whispered. My voice sounded rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. Sarah leaned in, her gaze steady. Because your parents think they broke you, and I've always had a soft spot for things that refuse to stay shattered. 2 days later, I was on a bus. I watched my old life disappear through a scratched window. I watched the water tower of my hometown shrink until it was nothing but a speck on the horizon. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, cold lightness in my chest. The city was a monster of steel and noise, but it was a monster I could hide in. The bakery was tucked away on a corner, where the bricks were covered in ivy, and the air always smelled like burnt sugar and yeast. Sarah's sister Martha was a woman of few words. She handed me an apron and a set of keys. "The room is upstairs," she said, pointing a flour-covered finger at a narrow staircase. "Work starts at 4 a.m. Don't be late." That night I laid down on a thin mattress on the floor of my new home. It was barely bigger than a closet, but it was mine. No one could yell here. No one could tell me I was a disappointment. As the weeks passed, my body began to change. The secret was becoming visible. I worked until my back ached, lifting crates of flour and scrubbing pans until my knuckles bled. I saved every cent. I didn't buy new clothes. I just pinned my jeans higher. But life has a way of throwing a curveball just when you think you found your footing. It happened on a Tuesday. A sharp, stabbing pain knocked the breath out of me. I collapsed in the middle of the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon swirling around me as the world went gray at the edges. I remember Martha's voice calling my name, sounding like she was underwater. I remember the sirens, the bright lights of the ER, the cold touch of a stethoscope, and then the silence. The doctor's face was blurred, but his words were crystal clear, words that would reshape the next decade of my life. Words that would become the foundation of the trap I would eventually set for the people who threw me away. The hospital room was too white. It felt like being inside a cloud that didn't want you there. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic beep of a monitor, a sound that felt like a hammer hitting a nail. I looked down at my hand. It was pale, hooked up to an IV, looking smaller than I remembered. Martha was sitting in the corner, her apron gone, replaced by a worn cardigan. She looked older in the harsh fluorescent light. When she saw my eyes open, she didn't rush over. She just let out a long, heavy breath. "The doctor said it was a hemorrhage," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was honest. "Lily, you're only 15. Your body, it just couldn't carry that weight while you were working 18 hours a day and barely eating." I didn't ask the question. The hollowness I felt inside wasn't just emotional. It was physical. The pact I had made with the life inside me, the mountain climbing, the ocean visits, it had been severed. I didn't cry then. I think I had run out of tears somewhere between the bus station and the bakery floor. Instead, a different kind of sensation took root. It was cold. It was sharp. It was a realization that the last link I had to my old world, and the only hope I had for a new one, was gone. "I'm sorry," Martha whispered, finally coming to the bedside. "Don't be," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the girl I used to be. "It's better this way. Now there's nothing left of me for them to hate." But that wasn't entirely true. In that moment of loss, a seed of a plan began to germinate. If my parents wanted a tragedy, I would give them one. If they wanted to believe I was a fallen woman with a child of shame, I would let that story grow in the shadows of their minds. I would let them wonder. I would let them build a version of me in their heads that I could eventually use against them. I went back to the bakery a week later. I worked harder. I stopped talking. I became a machine. I spent my nights in that small room above the shop, not sleeping, but studying. I used the library's computers to learn everything I could: business, finance, law. I realized that the only way to never be thrown away again was to become the person who owned the building. Years passed like pages turning in a book I was writing in secret. I moved from the bakery to a waitressing job, then to an office assistant role, then into real estate. I changed my last name. I didn't want to be Lily Rose, the girl from the rain. I became L.R. Sterling. I became a woman who wore tailored suits like armor. I became a woman who bought old buildings and turned them into something beautiful. I was successful, I was wealthy, and I was entirely alone. Exactly how I thought I needed to be to stay safe. But then, the letters started coming. It had been 12 years. I hadn't changed my email address from the one I created in that library a decade ago. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe a small, pathetic part of me wanted to see if they'd ever look for me. The first subject line read, "Lily, please." I stared at it for an hour before opening it. It was from my mother. She wrote about how my father's health was failing. She wrote about regrets and misunderstandings. But it was the last paragraph that made my blood turn to ice. "We know you had her, Lily. We know you were pregnant when you left. We've seen the photos of a little girl online that people say looks just like you. Your father just wants to see his granddaughter before he goes. Please, bring her home." I leaned back in my leather office chair, the city lights shimmering outside my floor-to-ceiling windows. They didn't want me. They wanted the pure legacy they thought I'd produced. They had invented a child to forgive, because they couldn't figure out how to forgive the daughter they'd discarded. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. They wanted a granddaughter? Fine. I would give them exactly what they asked for. Part 4. The Invitation to a Ghost. Story continued. The computer screen glowed in the dark of my office, casting sharp shadows against the walls. I reread my mother's email again. "We've seen the photos of a little girl online." I knew what they had seen. A few months prior, I had done a charity photo shoot for one of my development projects, a new community center. I was pictured laughing with a group of children from the local neighborhood. There was one little girl, a blue-eyed firecracker named Maya, who happened to be standing right next to me, holding my hand. To a stranger or to parents blinded by a decade of guilt, she looked like a mini version of the girl I used to be. They had built a fantasy around a stranger's child, because their pride couldn't handle the reality of what they had actually done to me. I didn't reply immediately. I let them stew. I let them check their inbox every hour for 3 days, just as I had checked the mailbox for a letter that never came during that first freezing winter. I wanted them to feel the weight of silence. On the 4th day, I typed a response. It was short, it was clinical. "I will be in town this weekend. I'll bring the girl, but we do this on my terms. We meet at the old diner on the highway, not at the house." I didn't sign it, Lily Rose. I didn't sign it at all. Driving back toward my hometown felt like traveling through a time machine. The trees became more familiar. The air grew heavier with the scent of pine and damp earth. Every mile marker felt like a scar. I pulled my black SUV into the gravel lot of the diner. It was a place where the coffee always tasted like copper and the vinyl seats were held together by duct tape. I chose it because it was neutral ground. It was where the truckers stopped, where no one knew my family's holy reputation. A cream-colored silk blouse, tailored trousers, and a watch that cost more than my father's truck. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like the person who decided whether or not your loan got approved. As I walked toward the entrance, I saw them. They were sitting in a corner booth, staring at the door. My father looked smaller, his skin like parchment paper. My mother had more gray in her hair, her hands nervously shredding a paper napkin. When the bell above the door chimed, their heads snapped up. I saw the flash of recognition, and then the confusion, because I was alone. I walked over to the table, the click of my heels echoing on the linoleum. I didn't sit down. I stood over them, watching the way they shrunk under my gaze. "Lily," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "Where is she? Where is our granddaughter?" My father leaned forward, his eyes searching the space behind me, looking for a ghost. "You said you'd bring her, Lily. We've prepared a room. We bought toys. We just want to make things right with the child." "Make things right with the child?" I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air like smoke. I pulled out a chair and sat down, crossing my legs. I took a long, slow sip of the water the waitress had set down. "You're 12 years too late for that," I said. My voice was as calm as a frozen lake. "But let's talk about why you're really here. Is it for her, or is it for the version of yourselves you want to believe in?" My father's face reddened. "Now see here, we admitted we were wrong to let you go. But a child needs her family. She needs her grandparents." I leaned in, resting my elbows on the table. "You don't even know her name. You don't know what she likes to eat, what she dreams about, or how she cried when she had her first fever. You don't know her because you didn't care about the mother who was carrying her when you threw us both out like trash. We're sorry for that," my mother cried, drawing looks from the other patrons. "But please, Lily, just let us see her, just once." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small leather-bound folder. Their eyes lit up. They thought it was photos. They thought it was a school report. They reached for it with trembling fingers. "You want to see her?" I asked. "Fine, look." The leather folder hit the table with a dull thud. My father reached for it first, his hands shaking so violently that he fumbled with the clasp. My mother hovered over his shoulder, her breath hitching in anticipation. They expected to see a smiling face, a gap-toothed grin, or perhaps the same hazel eyes that used to look at them with adoration before that ninth-grade nightmare. They opened it. The first page wasn't a photo. It was a hospital bill from 12 years ago, detailed, cold, and final. Beneath it was a copy of my high school equivalency certificate, earned while working 2 jobs. Beneath that, a series of bank statements from my first year in the city, showing balances of $3, $9, and 0. "What is this?" my father rasped, flipping through the pages. "Where are the pictures, Lily? Where is the girl?" "Look closer," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the diner's background noise. "Look at the dates. Look at the emergency room intake form from that November. Read the line where it says reason for admission." My mother's eyes scanned the document. I watched the moment she found it. I watched the blood drain from her face until she was the color of the salt shakers on the table. Her hand went to her mouth to stifle a sound that was half sob, half gasp. "Spontaneous miscarriage," she whispered. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "The little girl we saw on the news, the one in your arms. That was Maya," I said, leaning back and letting the folder stay open between us, like an open wound. "She's the daughter of one of my employees. She's a lovely child. She has a family that loves her. But she isn't mine, and she certainly isn't yours." The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens after a car crash, before the screaming starts. My father stared at the hospital bill as if he could change the words by sheer force of will. "You lied to us," he growled, his old temper flickering for a second before dying out. "You led us to believe. You let us hope." "No," I corrected him sharply. "You lied to yourselves. You created a fantasy where I succeeded in spite of you, just so you wouldn't have to face the fact that you killed the only version of me that ever loved you. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a second chance at being good people without ever having to apologize to the person you actually hurt." I stood up. I didn't feel the rush of triumph I expected. I just felt clean, like I had finally scrubbed the last of their dust off my shoes. "I didn't come here to show you a granddaughter," I continued. "I came here to show you exactly what you threw away that night in the rain. You didn't just kick out a pregnant teenager. You kicked out every future we could have had. You didn't lose a grandchild 12 years ago. You lost her the moment you closed that door." My mother reached out to grab my sleeve, her fingers grazing the silk of my blouse. "Lily, we're old, we're alone, we have nothing." I looked down at her hand, then back into her eyes. "I know what it's like to have nothing. I learned that lesson from you. It's a lonely path, isn't it?" I turned to walk away. I looked back at the 2 broken people sitting in a booth in a town that had forgotten them. "The room you prepared? The toys you bought?" I asked. "Give them to the shelter on 4th Street. There are actual children there who need a roof. Don't waste them on a ghost." I walked out of that diner without looking back. The bell above the door gave one final cheerful chime that felt like a mockery of the wreckage I had left at the table. The gravel crunched under my heels, a sharp grounding sound that reminded me I was no longer that girl with the leaking shoes. I climbed into my car, but I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the reflection of the diner's neon sign in my windshield. I expected to feel a surge of power. I had spent years imagining this confrontation, practicing the lines in my head while I scrubbed floors and signed contracts. I had won. I had delivered the truth like a cold blade. But as I sat in the gathering twilight, all I felt was a profound, echoing stillness. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a notification from the office, a mundane question about a zoning permit for a new project. It was a reminder that my life was full of things: buildings, employees, bank accounts, and schedules. I looked at the diner window. Through the glass, I could see them. They hadn't moved. My father was slumped over, his head in his hands. My mother was staring at the leather folder I had left behind, her shoulders shaking. For a split second, a tiny flickering moment, the old Lily Rose wanted to go back in. She wanted to tell them it was okay. She wanted to tell them that she had built a life, and that they could be a part of it, even if there was no child. But I wasn't that Lily anymore. That girl had died in a hospital bed 12 years ago, surrounded by white walls and the smell of antiseptic. I realized then that their begging wasn't about love. They were terrified of disappearing from the earth without leaving a mark they could be proud of. They wanted a granddaughter to carry their name, to prove to the town that their discipline had worked in the end. They didn't want the woman who had clawed her way out of the dirt. They wanted the child who didn't exist. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, a sophisticated, powerful sound that drowned out the quiet desperation of the parking lot. I shifted into gear and pulled away, the headlights cutting a path through the dark. As I drove back toward the city, I passed the park I had sat in all those years ago. The swings were still there, the chains were still rusting, but the park looked smaller now, less like a looming shadow and more like a tired piece of land. I thought about the child I had lost. For years I had mourned her as a tragedy, but tonight I saw it differently. She had been my protector. Her loss had forced me to become iron. She had saved me from ever returning to that house as a weakened version of myself. I pulled over at a rest stop a few miles outside of town. I needed to breathe. I walked to the edge of the lot, looking out over the valley. The lights of the town were tiny, flickering dots. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. I was 30 years old. I was successful. I was free. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was running away from something. I felt like I was arriving. But as I stood there, my mind drifted to the one thing I hadn't expected. My mother's last words. "We have nothing." It wasn't a plea for money. It was a confession of bankruptcy, the kind that happens to your soul when you realize you've spent your whole life investing in the wrong things. The drive back to the city was longer than the drive out. Silence is heavy when you're carrying the weight of a decade-old truth. I kept the radio off, letting the hum of the tires on the asphalt be my only companion. I kept seeing my mother's eyes, not the cold, judgmental eyes from 9th grade, but the hollowed-out sockets of a woman who had realized she was standing in a house she'd built out of sand. I wondered if they would go home and throw away the toys they'd bought. I wondered if they'd leave the granddaughter's room exactly as it was, a shrine to a person who never drew a single breath. By the time I reached my penthouse, the city was in full bloom with neon and movement. I stood on my balcony, looking down at the ant-sized cars. In this world, I was L.R. Sterling. I was the woman who had transformed the skyline. But inside, there was still that tiny, shivering 14-year-old girl sitting on a park bench in the rain. I realized then that the revenge I had sought wasn't what I actually needed. The ledger was balanced, sure. I had made them feel the sting of the door slamming. I had made them mourn a ghost. But as I watched the moon hang over the skyscrapers, I knew that true freedom didn't come from hurting them back. It came from finally letting them go. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. There was one final thing I had to do. I didn't want their letters. I didn't want their updates on my father's health or their apologies that felt more like excuses. I composed a final email. I am leaving the leather folder with the diner manager. It contains the proof of my journey, not for you to weep over, but for you to understand why I will never return. I am not angry anymore. Anger requires energy, and I need all of mine for the life I've built. Do not look for me. Do not write to me. You asked for a granddaughter, and you found out she was a ghost. Now, you have to find out what it's like to have a daughter who is a stranger. Live well with what you have left. I hit send. Then I did something I should have done years ago. I deleted the account. I blocked their numbers. I erased the digital trail that led back to the girl named Lily Rose. That night, I didn't dream of the hospital. I didn't dream of the rain. I dreamed of a vast open ocean, the one I had promised that child we would find. I was standing on the shore, the water cold and bracing against my feet. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I wasn't looking for a savior. I was just there. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city was waking up, and for the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel like I was a character in a tragedy. I was the author, and I was ready to start a new chapter. But life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. As I was heading out to my car, my assistant called. "Ms. Sterling, there's a young girl at the reception. She says she's looking for someone who used to live in your old town. She says she has something that belongs to you." My heart skipped. Was it a trick? Had they sent someone? "Her name?" I asked, my voice tight. "She didn't give one," my assistant replied. "She just said to tell you she found the diary, the one from the park bench." The air in the lobby felt thin. I stepped out of the elevator, my heels silent on the plush carpet. Standing near the glass entrance was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16. She wore an oversized denim jacket and scuffed sneakers, looking exactly like a mirror held up to my own past. In her hands, she clutched a small, water-damaged notebook with a fading floral cover. It was the diary I had lost that night at the bus stop. The one I thought the rain had claimed forever. "Miss Sterling?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Where did you find that?" I whispered, reaching out to touch the warped pages. "I found it tucked behind the radiator of the old bus depot," she said. I'm staying there now." I read the first page. It had your name and the town. "I looked you up at the library. You're famous for the buildings you build." I looked at the girl, really looked at her. I saw the dark circles under her eyes. I saw the way she held the diary like it was a shield. She wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't my daughter. She was something more important. She was a reminder. "Why did you bring it all this way?" I asked. "Because," she said, a small defiant spark in her eyes. "You wrote in the back that you were going to be someone. I needed to see if you actually did it. I needed to know if it was possible." I felt a lump in my throat that no amount of success could swallow. I reached out and took the diary, but I didn't pull away. I looked at this girl, this new Lily, and I realized that my story hadn't ended at the diner. It was just changing shape. "It's possible," I told her, my voice firm, "but you don't have to do it from a bus depot. Come inside, let's get you something to eat, and then we're going to talk about your future." I didn't look back at the shadows of my parents. I didn't think about the child I lost. I realized that while I couldn't change my past, I could build a roof for someone else's future. The cycle of discarding people ended with me. I walked her into my office, the sun reflecting off the glass towers of the city I had conquered. My parents were left with their empty room and their plastic toys, mourning a girl who never was. I was finally, truly, home. End question. If you were Lily, would you have ever let your parents meet a fake granddaughter? Or was the truth the better revenge? If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and subscribe to Lily Calm Stories for more deep, realistic tales of strength and survival.